Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Dr. Taslim Alani-Verjee, and I am the director and founder of Sloan Center for Mental Health. I am also a practicing clinical psychologist. So today we're going to be talking about trauma. Now, why trauma? Trauma, one, because the recent circumstances have been hard on a lot of us. But the reality is that even outside of the current circumstances, trauma is real for so many of us. And so when we don't understand what's going on, when we don't really know what trauma is, that can be pretty challenging. And so today's webinar is meant to walk us through what exactly trauma is, what happens to us when we're experiencing trauma, and some of the ways that we can cope with it. I also want to spend some time at the end talking about what we can do when someone else is experiencing trauma. Now, there is the opportunity to ask questions, so please do feel free to do so. The best way to do it is to send me a message in the chat. I will probably go through all of the questions at the end of the webinar, so that's your best time to have your questions answered, and they will come directly to me. So when you do have a question, know that no one else will see that it's you asking the question, but I will try to get to them at the end. So keep them coming throughout, and then we'll go through them at the end. So first, what is trauma? Trauma is our response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event that ends up overwhelming our ability to cope. It might cause feelings of hopelessness. It might diminish our sense of self or our ability to feel a full range of emotions and experiences. What these specific events are will range and vary from person to person. So there's no specific event that any of us will experience that will just be traumatic. For some of us, it may be considered traumatic, and for others, we may not have a trauma response. There is no black and white to it. But some of the things that are helpful to consider is, for example, 38,000 people in the US die from car accidents every single year, and another 4.4 million are injured seriously from car accidents. That's a lot of people. 1 in 3 women are affected by sexual violence in Canada. Racist microaggressions continue to be as present as ever, as does police brutality, as we're seeing in the news regularly, but just the past couple of weeks, as well as overt expressions of racism. Intimate partner violence accounts for 1 in 4 violent crimes reported to the police in Canada. Refugees, so those who fled violence and persecution in their home countries, account for 15% of permanent residents in Canada. And then there are first responders who are likely to encounter traumatic events every single day that they work. And these are just some of the ways that people can survive trauma. There are countless more when we talk about single events such as assault, harassment, getting injured, experiencing or surviving a natural disaster. And it's not just when things happen to us directly that we may experience the effects of trauma. Even watching someone else go through that trauma, having to overcome it, having to survive it, that in itself can make us have a traumatic response. It's also important to remember that we're not all equally vulnerable, but that we probably all will experience trauma at some point in our lives. When we think about the statistics, the number of things that could possibly be upsetting to us, deeply distressing and disturbing, we likely will, if not already, encounter trauma in our lives. But some of us are more vulnerable. So, for example, women are considered more vulnerable to trauma. Black, Indigenous, and people of color are more vulnerable. Members of the LGBTQ plus communities are more vulnerable. People living with disabilities are more vulnerable, often because these groups of people are more targeted. Then when we think about how some groups of people have several marginalized identities coming together, then we can see that not everyone is at the same level of risk of experiencing trauma because people are treated differently in this world. Now, the reason I bring this up is because when we think about what goes on in the body and the mind in response to trauma, it's helpful to reflect upon what might happen when we are experiencing a lack of safety regularly. And for these folks, for many of us, this is our reality every single day. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail as we go through this webinar. But I just wanted to bring it to your attention so that as we go through this, that's something that you can be thinking about. So when we're faced with a threat, let's imagine we're walking down the street and we come across a lion. Now, what's going to happen? Our body is going to activate a stress response. It's going to be in survival mode. And this is very normal because we do need to survive. So we will notice that, for example, our adrenaline will be pumping. We might have our cortisol levels, and that helps us deal with pain and inflammation. Our blood sugar will go up, and this gives us extra energy for our muscles. Increased blood pressure so that we can move faster, endorphins to help us ignore physical pain. We may also experience this as heart racing, shortness of breath, feeling hot and sweating. This is clearly about survival. In that moment, we see the line and we need to survive. We might make quick decisions because this also is necessary in order for us to survive. What we don't talk about so much is what happens after the lion, assuming we survived, right? Usually when we have that conversation about the lion and the fight and flight response, it ends there. But let's be real, we just saw a lion in the middle of the street. And what we're going to do with that largely depends on how we perceive the world, how we make sense of our experience with this lion. But probably that was a pretty traumatic event, right? We were probably scared for our lives because, hey, we just saw a lion. And so we need to deal with it. But this is when the conversation about trauma begins. For some of us, we see the world as a very predictable, safe, and just place. Things happen for a reason. Things happen the way that they are supposed to. Now, when we believe that this is the way the world works, and we see a lion in the street, a lion we probably weren't expecting to see, the world becomes less predictable. The world becomes less safe. Now, for some of us, that will turn into, hey, the world's safe most of the time, but sometimes I might see a lion. For others, it might mean, hey, I probably did something to make that lion come to me, so the world is still safe and predictable and just, and I just need to do a better job to control things so that I never see a lion again. And for others, it might mean that the world is no longer a place that we can understand, that we can trust, and that the world is unsafe. And we can see that depending on how we interpret the situation, but also depending on how we saw the world before, that will affect how we interpret this encounter with the lion. So if we are able to recognize that the world does have some unpredictability to it, this can usually protect us at least a little from the significant effects of trauma. It won't always protect us 100%, but for those of us who are really fixated on the predictability and on the structure of the way the world works, the effects of trauma are generally going to be more significant. So after a trauma, after this lion or whatever else this trauma is, we may feel physically unsafe. We may feel like the world is completely unpredictable. We may feel like things can never be the same again. We may distrust others, not only the lion, but maybe there were bystanders that we wish would have come and done something and they didn't. And so now we can't trust others. We may also doubt ourselves, especially if we think that we had something to do with the lion coming to attack us, or we feel like we made the wrong decision to run away from the lion instead of fighting the lion, or if our bodies freeze and there is nothing we could do in that moment because that was just the physiological reaction that we had. And so when we experience these things, that can also create some self-doubt. So when these things happen, it can affect our self-worth, our decision-making, our ability to connect with others, our ability to set goals, especially if we feel like the world is unpredictable, then we may see no point in setting goals to begin with. We might experience intrusive thoughts. So these are thoughts that pop into our mind when we are focused on something else. Usually they are upsetting or at least distracting. Sometimes they can be about the trauma. Sometimes they can be about something else. We may also be worried a lot of the time. We may have trouble sleeping. We may have difficulty focusing. We may have bouts of uncontrollable crying. We might experience blame, self-judgment, and we may just be overall unhappy and unsatisfied with life. These are typically normal reactions to trauma. And sometimes they'll go away pretty quickly within a couple days or a couple weeks. Sometimes we may not even experience any of it at all, and we may just bounce back. Or sometimes we just kind of ignore it completely from our memory and we don't deal with it at all. Whatever our reaction, know that it's our mind's way of protecting us. Whether these symptoms stay around for a really long time, whether they go away, our body and our mind is trying to protect us from unsafety. And so when we talk about trauma responses, while they are generally unhelpful because they get in the way of us living the life we want to live, it's actually our body trying to save us, to protect us, to make us be able to live longer. And so when we're frustrated with that, having some compassion towards our body's efforts to try to protect ourselves is important. And when we're talking to others who are experiencing trauma responses, when they are going through all of this, remembering that this is their way of surviving, this is their way of dealing, this is their way of knowing that they're going to be safe. The problem is, even when the threat is gone, we still feel like we're in danger and like the world is unsafe. The lion is gone. It's been a couple of weeks, no encounters with lions again. We also know that for most of our life, we didn't encounter a lion. And so the probability of encountering a lion is pretty low. And yet, if we still feel like that lion can pop out at any single time, that's when we know that it's kind of becoming a problem, right? We may change our behavior to be safe, and our thoughts and our emotions may be focused on safety. And then we stop living the life we want to live. We stop being the people we want to be. And instead, we become so preoccupied by safety that we lose part of ourselves in the process. Our minds believe that we are constantly in danger. And so what's going to happen is our bodies are also going to believe that we're constantly in danger. So then we constantly are having those stress reactions, right? The adrenaline, the cortisol, all of it is coming up, our heart racing, the shortness of breath, because our body is constantly preparing for fight or flight, as if we're about to see that lion. Now, when our bodies are going through chronic stress like that, it becomes a bit of a problem. When we talk about chronic stress, this can lead to cardiovascular disease. It can lead to gastrointestinal problems. It can lead to menstrual problems, skin and hair problems, and obesity. Now, this is just what's going on physically within us, but imagine what's going on in the mind when we're constantly on guard, when we're constantly watchful of our environments, when we constantly feel like we're in danger. It becomes really hard to be ourselves, to feel comfortable in the world, to navigate things. It becomes hard to connect with others or to connect with ourselves, or even to know what it is that we like or who we want to be, because we are constantly preoccupied by safety. Sometimes, because this is so uncomfortable, what we'll do with the stress is we'll actually avoid it. And so this can be through using substances such as alcohol, cannabis. We might use recreational drugs or misuse prescription drugs. And these are efforts to make the stress and make the pain, make the discomfort go away. We might engage in self-harm through cutting or burning or hitting. We might engage in overeating in order to try to make ourselves feel better. We might gamble. We might engage in sexual behavior more frequently. We might isolate ourselves so that we don't need to deal with other people. We might abdicate our responsibilities, so we'll stop going to work, we'll stop cleaning our homes, so that all we're focused on is ourselves and our safety and knowing that we're safe at home. And we'll avoid things in general. Now, this is usually unhelpful and can generally make things worse because we're not dealing with our emotions, we're not dealing with our fears, we're not dealing with the problem. And so when we avoid while in the moment, that can make us feel a lot better, actually generally makes things worse. So, what can we do about the trauma? The very first thing we want to try to do is accept that it happened. This is one of the hardest things to do, though, because so often trauma is because of injustice that happens. Whether it is unpredictable, universe just doing what it's going to do injustice, or whether it was targeted injustice, something happened to us that shouldn't have happened, and it's not okay. And yet, when we're stuck in the it's not okay, it's hard. We're causing extra problems for ourselves because it's almost as though we're not giving ourselves permission to move on. Instead, what we're doing is being stuck in what should have been, what could have been, what ought to have been, When we can accept that the trauma happened, it gives us the opportunity to move on. It doesn't mean the trauma was okay, doesn't mean the injustice was okay, but it means that we're ready to accept that it did happen. We also want to try to manage our physiological symptoms. And so, again, when we're experiencing trauma, our bodies are constantly having stress reactions. And so, what we want to do is try to manage those stress reactions. Some of the ways that we can do that are by engaging in deep breathing. Now, I remember hearing deep breathing for the first time and thinking to myself, well, that's a pretty small intervention for all of the difficulties that we're dealing with. But the trick is that our bodies can't actually be stressed and relaxed at the same time. It's physiologically impossible. And so by inducing a relaxed state within our body, we're allowing our body to not be stressed. And so if we can deep breathe and we can focus on the breathing or focus on some sort of visualization that allows us to relax, we will not be stressed, at least for that moment. And the more frequently we can protect it or practice it, the more we can allow ourselves to have moments of not being stressed. Now, this in and of itself won't stop the stress reactions, but what it will do is actually allow our bodies to be a little bit more in a state of relaxation more frequently. And that will decrease the likelihood of some of those stress reactions. The other thing that happens is that stress builds up in our bodies. And so if we're not taking time to release some of that stress and some of that tension, then it's always going to feel like we're holding it chronically. And so practicing letting some of it go can be really helpful. The other thing that we can try to do is to add more enjoyment in our lives. Even if it feels like we're not going to enjoy things, do them anyway. Whatever it was that you used to do before, try to do it again. Even if it's for 2 minutes or 5 minutes or 10 minutes, it doesn't matter. Pick up that guitar or those pencil crayons or bake or cook or take a bubble bath, paint your nails, whatever it is, build furniture if that's what you like to do, go fishing if that's what you like to do. Just do something. The more that we can take our minds away from inactivity, from fear, from the injustice, the more we can get back to our regular lives. And this is especially the case if one of the ways that we've been coping with the trauma is by avoiding and decreasing activity. When we sit around, when we stop doing our daily activities, we stop living the life we want to live, but usually it becomes a bit of a downward spiral. And so one of the ways to stop that spiral is to start doing stuff. Doing stuff is what we call behavioral activation. It's one of the best interventions for depression because depression is very much about not doing. And so what we want to do is start doing. And so whatever it is, start doing those things. The other thing we want to try to do is get comfortable experiencing difficult emotions. Now, this is obviously hard because no one wants to deal with difficult emotions. And we had a webinar just a few weeks ago on how to manage difficult emotions. But some of the things that we can do is to start labeling them so that we even know what it is that we're feeling. Remember that whatever it is that our body's response is, it's trying to protect us. So even though it's unpleasant, it's our body's way of trying to keep us safe. So sit with it, tolerate it. Your anger can never hurt you. Your sadness can never hurt you. Your fear can never hurt you. It's not fun, but it can't hurt you. So try to sit with it, try to identify with it. You might want to imagine it like a wave that comes and goes, but just get comfortable with it. And if you can predict when it is that you start to feel some of those things, create a nice environment for yourself. So it might be making yourself a cup of tea or getting a nice cozy fuzzy blanket and just let yourself feel. Now, when those feelings get too overwhelming, which sometimes they do, we might need to take some space from them. And so that might mean going for a walk or listening to some music, watching some TV, just taking a bit of space from the emotional experience. And if we need something a little bit more intense, then we can do things like eat something spicy or sour, hold something cold in our hand or put it on our neck, smell something that is very strong smelling like coffee beans, whatever it is, the goal is not necessarily to get rid of the emotion. It's actually never to get rid of the emotion, but to give ourselves enough space that we can unhook from that emotion. The moment we can unhook from it so that it's not controlling us anymore, we regain some control over it. But we never want to just silence it altogether unless we're getting unsafe, right? If we think that we're going to end up hurting ourselves or someone else in the process, then yeah, we want the emotion to stop so that we can continue to survive and that we can make sure we're taking care of others or at least not harming them. But generally, the goal is to experience those emotions and to remember that you're not going to feel that way forever. For most of us, we lived our entire lives not feeling stuck in those emotions. We probably had moments of them because we're human, but we weren't stuck in them. And so know and trust that we won't be stuck in them forever, even if we feel like we will be. Trying to get back to routine for that very same reason that we want to just start to do fun things. The more we can hang on to our routine and start to build it again, the better, the more we can get our lives back to the way they were before. It's not about forgetting the trauma, because we will never forget the trauma, but rather it's about continuing to live the life we want to live despite the trauma. And so if we can build our routine one step at a time, small steps, then we can start to rebuild the lives that we used to have and perhaps build new ways of living our life in ways that feel more congruent with where we're at right now. If the effects of the trauma have led us to have intrusive thoughts about it, or we avoid thinking about it, we don't remember the details of it, or if we feel like we're reliving it, so this is called flashbacks sometimes, then what we want to do is try to develop what we call a trauma narrative. So this is actually remembering what the trauma was, remembering what happened, remembering all of the details, not only what we saw, but what we heard, what we smelt, what we felt with our skin. All of those things can help us remember the trauma so that it doesn't become this thing that we avoid thinking about. If we avoid thinking about it, then it continues to have control and power over us. So by actively trying to remember it within a controlled environment, then we can start to make sense of it. And this is the next step. It's making sense of the trauma, making sense of what happened, how it affects us, why it happened, although sometimes we may never find an answer to that. We also want to try to make sense of ourselves and others with the trauma. Who is it that we want to be now? How is it that we want to connect with others? We may not even know ourselves anymore because we may feel like the trauma completely changed who we are. It completely changed our values. It completely changed how friendly we want to be or how open we want to be. And all of that is okay. We are always allowed to make decisions about the kind of person we want to be, the kind of people we want to interact with, how frequently we want to go out, how frequently we want to stay at home. Those are all our decisions to make. But when our trauma is the one making the decisions for us, then it's time for us to reclaim some of that. And so figure out, who is it that you are now? Who is it that you want to connect with? How do you want to connect with them? All of that becomes part of that healing process. And then for a lot of people, it's about doing something. So once we have started to process our trauma and we feel like we're making sense of it, we accept it for what it is, it no longer controls our lives. Many of us want to do something to make sure it doesn't happen to other people or to support other people who have experienced it. So this is the making sense and making it better. And so we might want to find ways to make it better. For a lot of women, they end up becoming crisis counselors or addictions counselors because these are some of the ways that they know that they can give back. But whatever it is, whether it's police advocacy, whether it's joining a support group, whatever it is, do the thing that's going to help you know that you are doing something to make it better. Let's go back for a second to think about the individuals who are more at risk of experiencing trauma. For these folks, for us, the trauma doesn't end because the world is unsafe. And every single day, the world continues to remind us that it's unsafe for us, whether it's stories in the news about police brutality or about other people trying to draw attention to the fact that we are more vulnerable, whether it's our stories not being taken seriously, whether it's people assuming that we have violent tendencies or unpredictable tendencies because of the way we look or who we affiliate with. The world is unsafe for so many of us. And so, in these cases, being on guard and being watchful, having a bit of preparation for fight or flight is important for survival. And yet, it's not helpful to our overall well-being. And so for each of us, we need to decide what we want to do with this. There is no right or wrong way, but a lot of the time, the steps still remain the same. So acceptance, recognizing that the reality of the situation is very real. The injustice is happening. It's not okay, and we don't need to accept the injustice and let it just happen, but it's not about that. It's not about letting life happen to us. It's about reclaiming control. And when we can recognize that the reality of the situation is that the world maybe doesn't care about us as much as it cares about other people, or police don't care about us as much as they care about other people, then we can figure out what we want to do about it. Managing the physiological symptoms is also really important because, like I said before, the stress response in our body can actually contribute to chronic health conditions. And it can affect the way that we connect with ourselves and with others. And so we still want to manage those. It's not about ignoring them, never ever about ignoring them, but rather being able to be effective in our management of them. So if we know that our body is having a response and there is nothing in our environment that is suggesting that we are unsafe or we are at risk, those are good times to manage those symptoms. And being able to connect with our bodies a little bit more around some of that helps us not be in chronic states of stress. And when we're not in chronic states of stress, we're less likely to develop some of those chronic stress illnesses. Learning to tolerate the difficult emotions. They're hard. And when you're a person who is targeted, marginalized, persecuted, you're probably going to have more of those. But being able to tolerate them means you're less likely to avoid them and to use unhelpful strategies in their avoidance. And then find strategies that work for us to be able to continue to be the people we want to be. No matter what happens to us, we want to continue to be the people we want to be, whether we are regularly faced with trauma, whether we're regularly faced with injustices, or whether this is the one time that it's happened. The goal is to be the people we want to be, and we get to decide who that is. And that might also change throughout our lives. But when we can really stop and think about who it is that we want to be, how it is that we want to present ourselves in this world, that allows us to start connecting with that and to start realizing it. Now, when we have other people in our lives who are experiencing trauma, so assuming it's not us, but it's other people, being able to be there for them with compassion is really helpful. There may be some assumptions that people should get over things quickly, or they should forget about the trauma or not think about it. But those kinds of suggestions are generally unhelpful because for the most part, we can't just forget, right? Something happened. And so instead of giving people advice that generally is unhelpful, sit with them, be there for them, let them know that you're there even when they're having a hard time. Help them be engaged with the world around them if that's going to help them. Check in on them, make sure they have what they need. It can be hard, especially if we see someone not doing well after a trauma, and yet our job is not to fix, our job is not to save, our job is to support. And so ask the person what they need, how we can help them. So I'll end it there, and I'll check this chat box for some questions. I see a couple here. So, so what can we do if our family members are the ones that are giving us most of the trauma? What can we do to keep boundaries from people in situations that feel like they're unavoidable? Now, this is often the case, right? Where one way to think about it is there are big T trauma. So these are the big life events that cause us to experience trauma. And then there are little T traumas. The little T traumas are still hurtful. So they're not necessarily life-threatening or life-altering, but they affect us in that they stop us from being able to live the life we want to live. And they stop us from being able to trust ourselves, trust others, connect with others. They bring about feelings of self-doubt, self-blame, self-judgment. And so they are still traumatic. what do? We have a choice. We always have a choice, and that choice might be a hard one, but it's an important one to make. The moment we realize that we are deciding the people we want to keep in our lives and the people we don't want to keep in our lives, especially when those people keep hurting us, that's when we're reclaiming some of our agency in the situation. Of course, that doesn't make it easy, but setting some boundaries can be helpful. So how do we do that? Number one is by letting people know that you're going to set the boundary. And that might be something that's feasible, might not be something that's feasible. You might also decide for yourself internally that you'll only connect with people in certain ways. So if you see them at family gatherings because that's just the way life works, or you see them out in the community because that's just the way life works, decide what you want to do ahead of time. So you might feel comfortable saying hello, but not engaging in conversation. You might decide that you don't want to share anything about yourself with these people, even though they're your family. Sometimes we put expectations on ourselves to be a certain way with family or be a certain way with friends because that's just the way we're supposed to be. And yet if these people are causing us harm, they don't really deserve to be part of our lives. They might not know that they're causing us harm. And so sometimes that feedback might be helpful, letting them know that the ways that they interact with us are unhelpful or they make us feel badly. But if we've tried that and it doesn't seem to be that they're receiving that information, then maybe we keep our distance. If people stop us from living the life we want to live, it seems that they get in the way of our goals. Maybe it's better to just not have those people in our life or to have them at arm's length. So for the person who asked that question, if you have a follow-up question to that, I'm definitely open to answering it. I see some other questions here. Is it ever too late to deal with trauma? No, never, ever, ever too late. Depending on how our bodies and our minds have dealt with the trauma, the way we will deal with it will be a little bit different. So for example, if we don't remember the details of the traumatic event, which happens sometimes, especially if it happened in childhood, or if the actual traumatic event in and of itself wasn't particularly that big, but we know that it's affecting us day to day. In those situations, we still want to work towards acceptance. We still want to work towards emotional regulation. We still want to work towards being the people we want to be. That never, ever stops. And especially if you know that that trauma is getting in the way, it still makes you engage in certain safety behaviors, then you want to be able to start dealing with it so that you can live the life you want to live and you can be the person that you want to be. Next question, how does one even begin to deal with trauma if it's so difficult? This is a great question. So when we think about dealing with trauma, we can think of it maybe in 3 phases. And I'm not making this up. It's actually called the Triphasic Model of trauma. So not made by me. But the first is about safety. So when we think about safety, what we mean is, do I have what I need? Do I know coping strategies? Do I have shelter? Do I have food? Do I have people who can support me as I start this journey of making sense of the trauma? If I am safe, then I know that even when I get emotionally upset, I won't lose everything in the process. I won't get myself into a dangerous situation because I know how to deal with things and I have a support system that can also help me with it. I have a roof over my head. And so that's the first stage. The second stage is to start making sense of it. And so sometimes what we might want to do is to think about how the trauma affects our lives. So it's not necessarily about remembering the traumatic event, but even just thinking about what does it mean for our lives right now? What parts of it are helpful for us? Because in some ways, trauma can be helpful because it can make us be more motivated to behave in certain ways. And so the trauma doesn't always mean it was bad. So think about, how is it affecting you? In what ways is it positively affecting you? In what ways is it negatively affecting you? How do you think about yourself now? How do you think about others? How do you think about the way the world works? And are any of those things that you are ready to start addressing? And maybe start there. Remembering the trauma isn't always necessary for us to be able to cope or to overcome. And so those are 2 different processes. Being able to recollect it and to overcome it through remembering is generally helpful and usually one of the most effective ways of overcoming trauma. And yet, if that's not the main part of the distress, if we're not having trouble remembering it, if we can remember it quite easily, or if it's completely gone from our memories and so there is no memory left for us, then we can still work on the other parts of the way that the trauma affects us. And so usually that's a good place to start. The last phase of that triphasic model is that being able to recontribute. So finding out what it is, it's called a survivor's mission. What is it that you want to do as a trauma survivor in order to give back or to affect change, to make sure that other people don't have to go through things the way that we had to. And so being able to engage in that survivor mission, being able to think about the kind of person you want to be post-trauma, all of that comprises that last phase. And so it's the who are you now with the trauma, not without the trauma, with the trauma, because we can never go back in time. So figuring out who that person is, figuring out who we want to be, how we want to be, who we want to be with, all of that is part of that third phase. And so it goes from safety to trauma processing to figuring out who we are now with the trauma. We know that we're starting to deal with the trauma when it takes up less space in our lives. And so for some of us, the traumatic experiences are at the forefront. We think about them every single day. They interfere with our ability to get things done. Now, if the goal is not to forget, then what does it actually mean? It means that we maybe think about it less throughout the day, or we still think about it, but it's less upsetting. And eventually, the other things in our lives, the other events in our lives, continue to fill up that space. Remember, for most of us, the trauma is one moment or several moments in our entire history, and yet the trauma tells us that that is the most important and most defining moment, yet it doesn't have to be. And so if we can remember that it's just one moment or several moments, not the entirety of our lifetime, and we can start living our lives that way instead of having the trauma be what defines us, that is also a good indicator that we are processing our trauma and that we are moving forward with it. How can someone get over a traumatic incident if there is a good chance of a similar incident reoccurring? This is a really good question. And this kind of takes us back to those who exist in more vulnerability as well. Now, this is a hard question, right? If we know that we are at risk of re-experiencing trauma, it's hard to walk around the world believing that we are safe. But also the reality is that we are never safe, right? Every single time we get into a car, we are putting ourselves at risk. And yet we trust ourselves, we trust other drivers that we don't even know, that we're all going to get through our journey safely. And if we can remember it that way, then even if we've been in a car accident, we know and generally we trust that we're probably not going to get into a car accident again. Now, when it comes to vulnerabilities, or not even vulnerabilities, when it comes to experiences, traumatic experiences that we are potentially going to re-experience, so things like sexual assault, things like a violent relationship, if we've moved from one war-torn area to another, then there is a high likelihood that we will re-experience these things. And so being able to decide, how is it that you want to live your life? Is it best for you to be watchful all the time of your surroundings? Is it best for you to just not go out so that you're safe? Or is it worth the risk, just like it's worth the risk getting into the car every single time, right? We get to choose the risk that we're comfortable with, but part of that is so much dependent on our values and the kind of person we want to be and the kind of life we want to live. So it's not about ignoring the likelihood of the trauma or ignoring the possibility, because the possibility of being traumatized is always there, and the possibility of being hurt is always there. It's just about how much space do we want to give to that, and how much power do we want to give to that. If people have experienced multiple traumas, which trauma do they address first? Now, this is also a great question, because like I said, we will all experience traumas in our lives, and many of us will experience several of them. Instead of thinking about each trauma as a separate entity, think about it instead as, how do these traumas all together affect our lives? Now, some may be more salient than others, and so we can always ask people, if you're, for example, a therapist, which one does your client want to deal with first? Or if you're doing this journey on your own, which one takes up the most space in your life? That's probably the one you want to start with first. Because part of it is recognizing that those other than the trauma processing itself, the remembering, the reflecting, the making meaning of the pain and the trauma, the rest of that stuff remains the same. And so if we want to work on managing the physiological symptoms of anxiety, if we want to work on acceptance, if we want to work on managing our emotions, if we want to work on making sense of ourselves, all of that can be done regardless of the number of traumas we've experienced. Now, if there is one or more salient trauma, then it probably is worth focusing on those more salient ones first. But what we might find is that as we start to unpack some of that and we start to make sense of it, the other ones start to hold less power as well. And this is because we're starting to figure out who we want to be with these traumas, right? And there's no way of knowing which trauma had which effect on us, because we are complex human beings who are constantly adapting and constantly changing. And so it's not necessary for us to choose one trauma and start to process that one first, unless there is a specific reason for us to do so. But when we start with one, usually what we'll find is that the rest of them will start to have less power over us as well. Where does the trauma of losing a loved one or getting a diagnosis of a major illness fit into the concept of trauma? It's a very good question. So these things generally would fall into those little t traumas, right? The things that are still really upsetting and hurtful and distressing. They change the way we see the world. They change the way we feel about ourselves and the way we feel about others sometimes. And so it's still considered traumatic. And so we may want to deal with it in very much the same ways. Now, when it's loss, or when it's the diagnosis of a major illness or something that we have very little control over, we may find that the resulting consequence to ourselves is anxiety, but we may find that it's actually something else. We may find that we are experiencing grief, or we are experiencing depression, or we may be experiencing preoccupation with our own health and our own livelihood. Whatever it is, we still want to be able to deal with it. So whether we're going to call it traumatic or not, that's up to us. What we find traumatic is what we find traumatic. And so being able to, again, go through those steps, recognizing and managing our symptoms, continuing to do our best to stick to our routine, to engage in enjoyable behavior, to connect with people, to be able to tolerate the difficult emotions. And then at some point when we're ready to figure out what that loss or what that diagnosis or whatever it is, what it means to us, who we want to be with that trauma. And when we can start to do that, again, it starts to hold less power for us. Okay, and what if the trauma we are going through is because of our parents? How can we keep them at arm's length if we live with them? This is a great question. And for so many of us, especially depending on our upbringing, trauma continues in the home, it continues in the family, and sometimes it's intergenerational, right? And so if our parents were raised in a certain way, then they know how to parent in a very specific way, and the trauma continues over and over and over again. Sometimes being able to have the conversation with our family, if that is a safe thing to do, if you think that they would be receptive to it, then that's definitely something to try. If that's not going to work, I would go back to trying your best to have those boundaries. Now, of course, if it's with parents, we have to still eat our meals with them. If we still need to get permission from them to do things, then this can be extremely challenging. But what I would wonder about is, of course, not knowing anything about the context or the situation, is how much of that is us engaging in safety behavior. So for example, if I don't want to do something that my parents want to do, how much of myself feels like I have to just to keep the peace? And is it possible for me to advocate or do things differently, to test the boundaries, to see how much autonomy I can have and how much autonomy I can exert to try to live the life I want to live? Now, it really depends on the nature of the trauma as well. If we're living in situations that are violent and abusive, sometimes it's best to just stay safe. That's what we have to do sometimes. And so in those situations, instead of testing boundaries, what we probably want to do is whatever we can to make sure that we're maintaining our safety and to try to get out of that situation. And so what I would suggest is a lot of different things depending on the context, but trying to exercise some autonomy if that's going to make you safe, or at least making sure that you are able to stay safe, doing some planning around how you can get out of the situation, or if the situation is getting worse, is there a place that you can go, whether temporarily or permanently, to get out of that situation? Now, with parents, again, it's a little bit more complicated, especially without a whole lot of knowledge around context, but often, not always, often our parents intend to do what they think is best for us, but they don't always know what is best for us. If it's that kind of situation, being able to have conversations about how what they're doing is hurtful to us, how it's traumatic to us, that can really open up a dialogue. And sometimes they might actually open up that they had to deal with a lot of traumas themselves. It doesn't make what they're doing okay. It doesn't justify the behavior, but they might not know any other way of dealing with it. And often when we talk about people inflicting trauma on others, it's very much about power and control, but that might be the only way they know how to get that power and control. And so being able to have conversations with the people who we believe are supposed to love us about that helps maybe us and them figure out where some of that comes from and to rectify some of those power imbalances. Now, that probably doesn't give the person asking the question very specific information on how to navigate this. I'm happy to chat with anyone after if there are specific circumstances that they want to share, but that's how I would answer that question without knowing a whole lot of detail about it. So I'm just going to see if there are any other questions here. I'm glad that there were so many. And maybe while I'm waiting, I will just get the slide up with our contact information. Okay, so I'm not seeing any additional questions here. So I would say that if you do have questions, feel free to reach out. Our email address is on the slide here. Our phone number is on the slide here. So you're always welcome to reach out. And know that we are still open, and we're seeing clients. Right now we're seeing clients virtually, so you can stay in the comfort of your own home and know that you're physically safe. And we're hoping at some point, whenever that happens, that we will be able to open our doors again physically and start being able to meet with all of you. But for now, we look forward to seeing you virtually. Never hesitate to reach out and know that we are here for the community, to support the community, and that we care. So thank you everyone so much for attending today, and we will see you soon. Bye.